These lectures are part of the Great Courses series. They are produced by the Teaching Company. These lectures are titled Great Authors of the Western Literary Tradition, Part 3, Literature of the Middle Ages. The lecturer is Dr. Thomas Noble. Dr. Noble is the Robert M. Conway Director of the Medieval Institute and Professor of History at the University of Notre Dame. He earned his B.A. in History at Ohio University and went on to earn his M.A. and Ph.D. in Medieval History at Michigan State University. Prior to taking his position at Notre Dame, Dr. Noble taught at the University of Virginia and Texas Tech University. He has received research grants and fellowships from the National Endowment for the Humanities, the American Philosophical Society, the University of Cambridge, and the Institute for Advanced Study at Princeton. In 1999, the University of Virginia presented Professor Noble with the Alumni Distinguished Professor Award, the institution's highest award for teaching excellence. Dr. Noble has published over 30 articles and book chapters, 150 book reviews, and has authored and edited several books, including The Republic of St. Peter. He is the co-author of Western Civilization, The Continuing Experiment, now in its 4th edition, and one of the most widely used college textbooks in the country. Professor Noble prepared the course guide that comes with these lectures. The course guide includes a detailed outline of each lecture, a glossary, a timeline, biographical notes, and an annotated bibliography. To get the most out of this course, you may find it useful to follow along with the outlines or review them before or after each lecture. Lecture 25, Beowulf.
My name is Thomas Noble, and I'd like to welcome you to the 3rd segment of this series of lectures on great authors. These lectures will treat the literature of Europe's Middle Ages. Now, the lectures themselves will be delivered by an historian who has taught medieval studies for more than 30 years and who directs the oldest Center for Medieval Studies in the United States at the University of Notre Dame. Now, literary theory and criticism will not be neglected in these literatures, but historical context will be emphasized. Now, that's partly because that's what I know best, but it's also true that until the fairly recent past, historical context, when was a work written, where was a work written, by whom was a work written, as well as literary antecedents, what works did the author know, what works did the author draw on, what works did the author allude to, were every bit as important as critical theory in attempts to understand particular works and also particular authors. Now let's begin our explorations with a paradox. The Middle Ages produced a rich and vast array of literary creations, but medieval literature didn't exist. First of all, medieval people didn't know that they were medieval. They had no concept of being different. Only in the 14th century did some thinkers begin to identify themselves very closely with the culture of Greek and Roman antiquity and to disdain the millennium that separated them from the ancients. Now, one consequence of the reflections of such scholars, and we're going to meet some of them later on in this series of lectures, was the tripartite division of Western civilization into ancient, medieval, and modern. Now, the Middle Ages, the time in the middle between antiquity and the modern world, note the curious plural, Middle Ages, were not named explicitly until the 17th century. It's important to say, too, that the notion that people of the 14th century held of themselves and their world tells us a great deal about them. And again, we'll encounter some of them later in our series of lectures. But it tells us very little about the world they dismissed. We don't turn to Petrarch to understand the Middle Ages. We turn to Petrarch to understand his world. So for our purposes, in this course of lectures, the term medieval is nothing more than a convenient frame of reference. We're going to be talking about Europe, basically, and we'll be talking about the period from sort of the 8th century until the 14th. Now, however we understand the term medieval, it forces us to think about roughly a millennium of history and of culture. It stands to reason, doesn't it, that one ought to be wary about making bold generalizations about so much time. Imagine, for example, if we were to take today's date and go back 1,000 years and try to generalize about the last millennium. Another important point, of course, is that Europe is a very big and complex place. This is true today, but it was no less true in the Middle Ages. So one should be, I think, careful generalizing about something that is allegedly European. It's hard to know exactly what that means. Fourth, we may say that literature itself is an elusive term. We're going to consider works in prose and in verse, works in English, in French, in Italian, in Spanish, works purportedly historical and works wholly imaginary. In other words, we're going to have a lot of things sailing under this literature flag. A medieval motto held that clericus id est literatus, a cleric, that is to say, a literate man. But we shall consider in detail very few works written in Latin, but we'll certainly be dealing with literate people. Now, medieval literature did not emerge entire and pristine at some point in the so-called Middle Ages. There wasn't a moment when all of a sudden a thing we can call medieval literature just appeared. Particularly in the earlier centuries of the Middle Ages, and that's where we're going to begin in just a few minutes with Beowulf, a vast stock of native stories and traditions exercised the imagination and the literary gifts of many writers. Now, the literatures of Greece and Rome, but especially of Rome, because Greek was relatively rarely known, were always models. They were models of style, they were models of formal structures, they were models of story motifs. The Bible was an enormously influential book in the Middle Ages. Yes, of course, it was a source of unalterable divine truths, but it was also a source of stories. It was full of engaging characters, and it was full of important literary forms. Remember again that the Bible is in prose and in verse, and it's legal material and social material and historical material. It is a great storehouse of information. One theme, therefore, that we're going to track fairly closely in this lecture, and indeed in the ones that follow, is the various uses that medieval writers made of the different kinds of sources that were at their disposal. Why did they follow this one and not that one? Why did they choose this and not that? Now, in order to assess, to understand, to enter into medieval European literature, I think we need to take three very important steps. First, we have to clear our minds. We mustn't assume that medieval people are just like us. They're not. The past is a foreign country. We'd be much better off imagining ourselves on another planet as we attempt to understand the world of the Middle Ages. And we should really try to avoid appeals to dubious concepts such as human nature. Generally speaking, when somebody says, well, human nature being what it is, you know that the person's going to speak nonsense. Second, we must try to grasp some fundamental aspects of medieval life and culture. Now, we'll reflect on these issues many times, but let's say in a preliminary way now that medieval society was based on ideas of rank, of hierarchy, and of order that seem very alien to our modern egalitarian values. Christianity was pervasive in medieval culture, of course, in a Catholic mode. But broadly speaking, we can say that the Christianity of the Middle Ages seems very odd in our modern secular world. We may also say, for example, that in the Middle Ages theology was the queen of the sciences. Yet in our times, theology seems neither prominent nor scientific. In the third place, I think we must try to acknowledge some of the kinds of changes and forces that have made our world different from that of the Middle Ages. Among many intellectual, cultural, social movements of modern times, we could point to Romanticism, for example. Now, the Romantic poets and musicians and painters of the 19th century in particular created many beautiful and wonderful works that still engage us and inspire us, but they created a Middle Ages that never existed. In many ways, they created what is, in the popular outlook, in the popular mentality, the sort of man in the streets view of the Middle Ages, but basically they created a Middle Ages that never existed. As a way of critiquing the mass, democratic, urban, industrial society of their own world. But just point to those terms: mass, urban, industrial, democratic. None of those things apply to the Middle Ages. We can identify some key thinkers: Darwin, Marx, Freud, for example. Now, whether one agrees with them particularly or not, one cannot deny that these writers have pretty dramatically changed our basic views about human character, human behavior, human motivation. We must also say, I think, that modern science and technology have fundamentally altered the ways we explain things and where we look for explanations. So, a few aspects of the Middle Ages that may be helpful to us in reflecting on these 12 lectures, and a few ways that we may helpfully sort of evacuate our minds of preconceived notions so that we can enter into the spirit of the authors and the books that we'll consider. Now, speaking of books, let's actually turn to the matter at hand and begin with Beowulf and the beginnings of literature in the British Isles. Now, Beowulf is the longest poem surviving from Anglo-Saxon England. It's by no means the only work in Old English. We'll have more to say about Old English in a second. There's a lot of literature in Old English, but there's nothing else like Beowulf. Now, Old English is our name for the language of the Angles and Saxons who settled in the British Isles, particularly that island we now call England, between about 400 and 600. Now, the Angles from Angle land, the narrow land, came from the base of Denmark, and the Saxons came from northern Germany, from Saxony. The language is Germanic. It is a Germanic language related to Old Saxon, related to Old High German, related to Old Dutch. It is the ancestor of the English we speak, the remote ancestor. It's more like, for example, the German that is spoken today than it is the English that is spoken today, but that's its filiation. That's the family tree in which you would go looking for Old English. Now, before Old English began being written down, it's important to say, there was already Celtic literature in Old Irish and in Old Welsh being written in the British Isles. Scholars worry about and study and reflect on what kinds of interrelationships might have existed between that Celtic material and the Old English material. Suffice it to say, there's not much connection with Beowulf, so we don't really need to turn particularly to that Celtic material. But together, the Celtic materials and the Old English materials are Europe's oldest surviving vernacular literatures. Vernacular, in other words, the literatures of the people, as opposed to Latin and Greek, the classical languages. Now, turning a little bit more directly to Beowulf, we find enigmas, we find puzzles, we find mysteries. We have absolutely no idea who wrote this poem. There's not even any point speculating on it. We have only educated guesses as to when it was written. I think we can say that until a generation or so ago, there was a broad consensus that the poem was written in the 8th century, or composed or put together in something like its present form. Slowly but surely that consensus is moving forward. I think probably most people now would say maybe 9th century, possibly early 10th century. But the fact of the matter is that we cannot actually say for sure when this poem was written. The poem itself survives in a single manuscript. It's quite remarkable that it survives at all. That manuscript was written, we can tell from the handwriting. Paleography is the scientific study of handwriting. Paleographers can tell us that that manuscript was written about the year 1000, plus or minus maybe 25 years. There are a few scholars who actually think that manuscript is Beowulf, that that's when it was composed. Most don't accept that view. Most say it is older, even if they can't agree on exactly when it was written. The surviving manuscript was apparently rediscovered by Lawrence Noel in about 1563. It had simply lain unnoticed and unread for hundreds of years. Now, there's a couple of reasons for that. The primary one being that Old English was increasingly an unknown language. It was a foreign language. People in England no longer could read it, no longer could understand it, no longer could speak it. So this curious book, and indeed all of the corpus of Old English material, survived only fragmentarily and only sort of just by the narrowest bits of luck. Now, a man by the name of Robert Cotton owned the Beowulf manuscript in the 17th century. his library was severely damaged by a fire in 1731. If you go to the British Library today, in the display cases, the Beowulf manuscript is always on display. You can go and look at it, and you can see the singeing on the edges of the pages. So the fact that it survived from Anglo-Saxon times until the 16th century when Lawrence Noel discovered it, and then the fact that it survived the fire in Robert Cotton's library is really quite remarkable. Now, scholars have had to reconstruct many aspects of the poem. This adds to problems as we try to understand it. We don't have exactly the text that left sort of the desk of the Beowulf poet. We have a work that has required an enormous amount of scholarly attention to put together in something like the form in which we now read it. Now, Beowulf itself is a vigorous, fast-paced poem of 3,182 lines. Fred Robinson of Yale called it the chief glory of early Germanic poetry. Now, we know a few things, or we can surmise a few things, about what the poet was up to. He clearly works with a variety of familiar tales and people. There is a tone in the poem that makes it clear to us, as its readers or its hearers — Beowulf was actually meant to be spoken aloud — there's a tone in the poem that makes it clear to us that the poet assumed the people who were listening to his poem in the first place would be familiar with these people, familiar with these stories, familiar with the kinds of things he was talking about. Though there is one interesting point to be made here. Beowulf never appears anywhere else in the literature of Anglo-Saxon England or of the Germanic peoples. Other figures who appear in the poem of Beowulf do appear elsewhere, but not Beowulf himself. Now, the poet could count on a high degree of familiarity on the part of his readers or listeners because he was dealing with their ancestors, or with, in legendary terms, the ancestral world from which they had come. This makes it more difficult for us. These people are not our ancestors. The familiar rings of the poem are not so familiar to us. Now, what is Beowulf about? Let's talk a little bit about the story itself, for it is indeed a wonderful story. Hrothgar, who is the wise and just king of the Danes, has been ruling well, has been ruling happily, and he has been celebrating in his magnificent hall, Heorot. Now, archaeologists have actually discovered great wooden halls that date back to the early Middle Ages that give us some sense, historically, of the kind of a place that Heorot was, the kind of place described in the poem. So there is certainly throughout this poem an air of realism, an air of realism. Now, a fierce beast, Grendel, the misbegotten offspring of Cain, the poet tells us, becomes jealous of Hrothgar's merriment, and he begins savagely attacking the hall, bursting into the hall and taking away and killing one after another of Hrothgar's retainers. Word of all of this has come to the young Beowulf. He hears of Hrothgar's plight, and he and some of his trusty followers make a plan to sail to Hrothgar's kingdom and there to try to help him. Now, Beowulf is clearly doing this to win fame. No question about that. The end of the poem, the beautiful sort of envoi, the poet tells us that Beowulf was leofgiornost, most eager for fame, hungry for fame. But he also seems to have gone to acquit a family debt. This, again, is one of those kinds of things that readers or listeners in the early Middle Ages would somehow have understood. There were connections among the royal families of the northern world, and somehow or other Beowulf's family had an old debt to Hrothgar's family, so Beowulf has gone down to kind of help him out. Well, Beowulf comes, eventually he sails over the sea, he comes to Hrothgar's kingdom, he approaches Hrothgar's hall. He enters, and there, in this warm and bright and lovely place where people are of good cheer on the one hand, and drinking and enjoying themselves, there is on the other hand an air of foreboding. For this monstrous beast, Grendel, is out there. Well, sure enough, Grendel rushes into the hall, and Beowulf locks into mortal combat with him. And they roll all around the hall, and the poet makes it very, very clear that Grendel has never come up against anybody like Beowulf before, and suffice it to say, Beowulf had never come up against anything like Grendel before. Well, in the course of the fight, and it's rather interesting because it's a close-run thing, The fight is portrayed in such a way that Beowulf might very well have been bested. In the end, he wrenches off Grendel's arm and shoulder. And Grendel sort of slinks away bleeding to the mare, to the cave at the bottom of the mare where he lives. Well, Grendel, and there then, shortly after, he dies. Well, Grendel's mother, who's never named, she's only Grendel's mother in the poem. What might that mean? That's a kind of an interesting problem. We'll come back to that a little bit later, perhaps. Grendel's mother seeks to avenge her son, and she now begins to wreak havoc on Hrothgar's hall and on Hrothgar's men. Beowulf then goes to the mare, and he plunges into the deep, and enters into a cave, which we mustn't imagine Beowulf sort of doing all of this underwater. He goes underwater and enters a cave or something so that there he can breathe. Well, he now has a tremendous battle with Grendel's mother. Now, Beowulf's followers are all sitting along the bank of the mere, and the water is boiling and bubbling up from the bottom, and they think, oh boy, Beowulf's dead. He's had it. Grendel's mother has surely killed him, and the time passes, and eventually Beowulf reemerges. Well, they go back to the hall, and amidst all kinds of celebration, Hrothgar gives Beowulf both his eternal thanks, and of course we have a sense here now that Hrothgar's family now owes something to Beowulf's family. Beowulf's praises are sung. He has earned some of that praise, some of that fame, some of that glory that he'd gone looking for, but, mark well, Hrothgar also bestows enormous treasure on Beowulf. So there is a kind of a cash nexus, if you like, in this story. Now, Beowulf, who is a Geat, that is to say, in legend, the Geats were the people of Geatland, of roughly what is now southern Sweden. So Beowulf goes home. He recounts his deeds. One of the things that you do in a story like this is you tell the story, you tell the deeds, you see. So he recounts his deeds. And then he gives this enormous treasure given to him by Hrothgar to his own king, Hygelac. Now, we might just mention, Hygelac is a figure who does turn up elsewhere in the literature, vernacular and Latin, of the early Middle Ages. But anyway, Beowulf gives Hygelac his treasure, and Hygelac gives Beowulf, in effect, a chunk of his kingdom. Well, Beowulf now rules happily, successfully, justly, for 50 years. A suspiciously round number, but anyway, he rules for 50 years. And during the latter years of his rule, his kingdom is harried by a fierce dragon. Now, the dragon lives in a cave, sits on top of an enormous mound of treasure, and so on. You may just know, of course, that J.R.R. Tolkien was a professor of Old English in Oxford. Many of the themes and stories that entered into The Lord of the Rings, for example, or The Hobbit, for example, came out of his imaginative engagement with the literature of Anglo-Saxon England over a long period of time. And indeed, Tolkien made distinguished scholarly contributions to the study of Beowulf and other Old English literature. Anyhow, back to Beowulf. Beowulf realizes he's got to go out and face this dragon. He's got to protect his people. He's got to meet this gruesome test. Well, what happens is he goes out to fight the dragon, and his trusty followers, these men who were supposed to be loyal to the death, these men who were supposed to do anything for their leader, cut and run. The dragon terrifies, off they go. Who stays? Beowulf's kinsman, Wiglaf. Well, Wiglaf and Beowulf contend with the dragon. Predictably, Beowulf does defeat the dragon. Less predictably, perhaps, Beowulf is mortally wounded. And shortly after, he dies. The poet ends with that little envoi I mentioned a moment ago, that Beowulf was just and kind and all of that, but most eager for praise. Now, we can look a little at some of the kinds of devices and techniques and so on that the poet uses. For example, the poet really jumps from the fight with Grendel's mother and the immediate aftermath of this in Hrothgar's hall to a point 50 years later where Beowulf is fighting the dragon. He uses, however, the Beowulf poet does, a whole series of flashbacks that kind of help to fill in the intervening 50 years. to fill in the story, to fill in some of the history. And his technique for doing this is rather interesting. Again and again and again, one of the figures in the poem, sometimes named figures, sometimes major figures, figures in the poem will make a prophecy. Something is going to happen. The poet will then go on with his narration, and then he will flash back and fulfill that prophecy. So there's a quite interesting way in which the texture of the poem is woven together. You know, textus in Latin, the verb texo texare, means to weave. A textus is something woven. Well, there's a very woven character to Beowulf. The story, therefore, is not a straightforward narrative. It's not sort of one thing after another. It jumps around, or it seems to jump around, but nevertheless, this is a poem that has great internal coherence, and it does come to a kind of closure. Although the closure may confuse us just a little. We're going to reflect on that again just a little bit here in the next couple of minutes. How do we understand this poem? What are some ways to approach it? What are some ways to think about how to read, how to enjoy Beowulf? Well, we could look, for instance, at some of the stylistic devices that the poet uses. The poem is constructed in half-lines with consonantal alliteration. Now we can see this in its opening lines, all right? What hwe hardena in jardium, feud kinninga thrimja frunen, who the edlingas elen fremedan. Listen. We have heard of the glory of the Speardanes kings in the old days, how the nobles of that people did great deeds. Well, I want you to mark two things there. You could hear the alliterations. In those lines. Consonants alliterate. The same sounds recur. We're more accustomed to rhyming poetry. Alliterative poetry is something a little bit different. The second thing I want you to notice, and I want to really expand on this point a little bit, we have heard. Not we have seen, not it happened in our times, not it happened here, not it happened to anybody we know, but we have heard. The poet introduces an authenticating voice. This is a very interesting technique. It's a common enough technique in epic poetry. We're going to meet it again in later texts that we'll consider in this course of lectures. But the poet repeatedly says, I have heard, I learned, they say, it is reported. In a sense, you see, what he does is places himself above the fray. He takes a kind of an Olympian view of the action. He's not pretending for an instant that he is an eyewitness. He's not pretending for an instant that he is, as it were, reading out for us some documents pertaining to the events that he is writing about. But nevertheless, all of this sense, I heard, they say, it is reported, is meant to reassure us. It's meant to give us a sense that all of this is in some way true. And again, as I was saying a little while ago, the allusions in the poem and the familiar stories in the poem, the stock of stories, may very well have been the kind of thing that, for the Beowulf poets, original listeners would indeed have had them nodding their heads. Yes, we have heard that. Yes, that is reported. Yes, I know people do say that. Now, another device that we can see in the poem, and I alluded to this a second ago, is this interweaving and recapitulation. Now, I've already mentioned it in connection with, for example, the way one will have these prophecies, and then the prophecies are fulfilled, and by making a prophecy, talking allegedly about the future, and then in the future at some point going back and fulfilling that prophecy, but at a moment in the past, we get, well, possibly a kind of a herky-jerky flow, but nevertheless, we certainly do get a sense of tying this whole story together. But there are other ways in which we can see these kinds of stitchings together, if you like, these weavings in the poem. Beowulf, for example, has 3 verbal combats. Now, if you know anything about the Iliad and the Odyssey and the Aeneid, and you've perhaps heard about these in earlier lectures in this series, then of course you know that one of the things that is common in epic poetry are speeches. Speeches can be made to individuals, they can be made to no one in particular, but there are lots of speeches. So Beowulf has 3 great verbal combats. Now in Old English literature we call those verbal combats flightings. All right, call them flightings. He has one with a shore guard when he arrives at Hrothgar's kingdom. He has another with a sentry when he comes to Hrothgar's hall. And then he has another with a man by the name of Unferth, unjustice, untruth, bad guy, one of Hrothgar's retainers who's a little jealous in the hall that this young stud Beowulf shows up and he's going to save them all from Grendel. Unferth takes this amiss. So there's a series of these quite remarkable verbal combats. Now, there are not only 3 verbal combats, there are 3 physical combats. Beowulf fights Grendel, he fights Grendel's mother, he fights the dragon. Now, we can also approach the poem by way of asking, what are some of its central themes? What's going on here? For example, is the poem Christian or pagan? And we might say, why does that matter? Well, another way of asking that question is to say, is the poem primitive or sophisticated? Here's the point. For a very long time, and again, particularly among the Romantics, there was a great desire to make this poem speak the voice, the authentic voice of the pagan, heroic, Germanic past. And so it was felt that wherever one finds Christian allusions in the poem, allusions to the Bible, remember Grendel is the misbegotten offspring of Cain. Wherever one finds biblical allusions or references to Christian theology or simply encoded Christian theology, in other words, the poet never says, well, St. Augustine said this and St. Jerome said that, but there are places where his writing is very consonant with that of some of the church fathers. Well, the heroic types would have said this was all added later. This was written into the poem. It was not there in the first place. Others say, no, this is a thoroughly Christian poem right from the beginning. It was written by certainly a Christian author, possibly a monk, possibly in a monastic setting. So scholars go back and forth on how much of this poem is pagan and how much Christian. Is the Christian written into a pagan poem, or is the paganism a kind of a classic stylized anachronism written into a poem that is itself Christian? Is the poem ironic? Are we supposed to like Beowulf or not? Are we supposed to admire him or not? The poet never tells us. He never tells us. He doesn't say what we're supposed to think. Why is the poem so full of gloom, doom, foreboding, and death? This has puzzled critics for a very long time. It's not, in the end, a happy poem. Is this a comment on the way the world really is? If you're happy now, that's great, but perhaps tomorrow will be different. The wheel of fortune will turn. Thus far, then, Beowulf.